So they used to go in Africa, and like how you go in the sea to catch fish, and catch all the Africans whom they could get, and carry them to the West Indies to plant sugarcane in the Caribbean islands. And they were treated, if I should tell you the truth, worse than animals. Worse than animals. Now imagine some African tribal chiefs, some wealthy Africans, anyone they could have put their hand on, they took them and they made them slaves to work like animals in the sugarcane plantation. And these facts, you will find it in the history books. So, on one hand, sugar was introduced as a crop in the Caribbean, an important economic asset to the Europeans. And Africans were introduced as slaves. Fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of the Africans were taken from some of the tribes, the Madingo and other tribes, and they were Muslims. Why did Allah allow that to happen? Only Allah knows. Allah says in the Quran, if He wants, He can replace you with another people. You know? If He wants, He can replace you. And He is showing us how this is possible. He can use human beings to replace other human beings. So the Caribbean Arabs, they died out. Now there are very small little elements of those. And the government of Trinidad and Tobago, for example, is trying to preserve whatever is left of the culture of these natives by making museums and keeping these and the few remaining elements of the tribes. They are trying to encourage them to become important and so on. As you have the Indians in America, the Red Indians and so on, they all extinct to a great extent because the Europeans wanted to dominate. And it is something we need to keep in mind. Allah says, "Why do mastatatum bil quwwah?" You can survive if you have strength. If you have strength, you can survive. But if you allow yourself to go down, well, what will happen? If you build your resistance in your body, you will be strong. You can fight out a lot of diseases. But if you don't take care, then what is going to happen? And these are the universal lessons for mankind. And Allah is using history, the history of human beings, the rise and fall of nations, to keep our mind focused on our goal, on our purpose, and our way, our lifestyle. We need to keep this in mind all the time. So my dear friends, now you have a new element in history introduced into the Caribbean. Foreigners coming to do the work. And not treated as human beings, but treated as slaves. So on one hand, these people who were well-to-do in their own countries, now they were held and they were beaten and all kinds of things were happening, you know. They were beaten like big animals. Some of them were given water to drink. You go down and you fall and you drink like an animal there. That is how the slaves were treated. Now if you have people like that, who were once upon a time well-to-do, they had their own servants and so on, and now you're making them slaves, will they work? The silent resistance, and it did not benefit the Europeans. So on one hand, they were treated as semi-human beings, and on the other hand, they were not permitted to practice their faith. A lot of Muslims, even in the Caribbean, died as Muslims, you know, the Africans. They held on to their faith, but they could not have passed it on to their children. And take note of that. You are supposed to pass on your legacy of faith to your offspring. And if you don't do it, you will make the link in the chain weaker for the future. And we need to keep that in mind. We'll be talking about that in some other places. Right? Now, amongst the Europeans, you had Spanish, French, Dutch, British. So 4 separate nations from Europe began investing in the Caribbean. by purchasing slaves and forcing them to grow sugar. At one time, Cuba is one of the Caribbean islands, although it's so big. Cuba used to produce so much of sugar that they said you could make a wall of sugar around the world. I mean, that is the extent of the production of sugar. Trinidad used to produce so much sugar, but the last government destroyed the sugar plantation. So sugar is no longer an important agricultural product in Trinidad. You see changes taking place all the time, and you'll understand. So here you had the Spanish masters, and you had the British traders bringing the slaves in and selling them to the Caribbean islands, and the business prospered for some time. But when they found that, listen boy, these Africans are not producing them, we have a problem. They decided to introduce other, laborers into the Caribbean. Now, a lot of the Africans who went were scholars and so on too. But they were forced to stay quiet. If you open your mouth, we cut it off. And they used to cut off their mouth or their hand or their feet and dig it as punishment. You could imagine. Listen, you may think I'm telling you a fairy tale. But if you punch in your internet Caribbean islands and you begin to read and so on, you will see what I'm talking about. Some of it is still there. So, after the era of the African slavery, Indians from India, Malays from this part of the world, Indonesians, they were introduced as indentured laborers. Indentured laborers was a type of slavery because they had to work very long hours. They were getting a little bit of food and something. They must have been getting a penny a day, 2 cents, or something like that. But there was a condition. After 5 years, they would have, if they wanted, they would get their passage to go back to their native land. Right? One important thing we need to keep in mind always, and that is, after the African experience, the colonial masters decided, we do not want any learned people to come here. Take the illiterate ones so you can manipulate them. And the illiterate ones from India went, and from the other parts. Today, you have concentration of Indians in Trinidad, in Guyana, which is part of South America, and you have, well, we call them the Javis, I think it's Malay, in Suriname. Some Indians and some Malay in Suriname. The rest of the Caribbean, they are basically people of African origin. Right? Caribbean islands, they were formerly British, French, Dutch. You see? So you have Spanish speaking, you have French speaking, Martinique and Guadeloupe and so on, and you have British, English speaking. Basically, the language there in the Caribbean now, basically is English. For everyone. Yes, you might have some of the people in Suriname, they speak a broken Dutch, and some of the people in some of the other islands speak broken Spanish called Patois, but basically it's English. What is interesting is the twang, the way of speaking the English varies from island to island. So the idioms and the expression and the pronunciation, you will listen and you will know that person is from such and such an island. And that person, like a Trinidadian. Anywhere in the world there will be a Trinidadian, you could know. The way he speaks, he cuts his sentences kind of abruptly. And the way he will greet you and the way he will speak to you, it's different from the rest of the Caribbean islands. So here we have now the Africans being a very important segment of the population, but their original culture and religion taken away from them, and Christianity was imposed upon them. Here you have people from India and from the Far East, if I should call it the Far East, coming in. They were in a way pressurized to accept native culture. But some of them still kept their dress and their food, the curry and so on, very popular, and their culture and their lifestyle. It was very difficult to take away the culture of the Indians, the Hindus and the Muslims. And they all call themselves, you know what, Jahaji Bhai. Jahaji Bhai means we are brothers of the same ship. Those who were taken to the Caribbean in the same ship, they considered, like you know those people who make the pilgrimage, they go to Makkah and they go in the same group, they consider themselves connected in some way, and they remember that all the time. So too with those who went to the Caribbean islands. The journey was around South Africa, up back to the Caribbean, and it was very frightening for a lot of them. Because sometimes when the ship had problem and the weight was too much, the best way to offload the weight was to throw over some of the human beings overboard and get rid of them. Strange, but true. Strange, but true. Is either all of us die, or some of you go, it's okay. We'll get less money when we sell the rest of whatever, when we make the contract. But it doesn't matter, we are going to reach there. And that is what happened. And that is the history of the growth of the Indians and African population in the Caribbean islands and Guyana and South America. What was beautiful about the Indians in Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana and Suriname is the Muslims kept their faith no matter what happened. We are Muslims, and there was great discord, and there was sometimes confrontation, physical confrontation between the indentured laborers, the Muslims, and their bosses. Really, it was sometimes it was scary, but they kept their faith. But you know, it was very difficult to survive, very difficult. Because up to the 1950s, if you wanted to get a government job or a teacher's job or anything, you had to be a Christian. Up to the 50s. But some of the Muslims held their faith. Now, imagine the situation. You get up 4 o'clock in the morning to go to work in the sugarcane fields, or the cocoa and coffee and orange and all these things, because they introduce all these other crops. And you reach back home 6 o'clock in the evening. Do you have time to pass on your legacy to your children? Do you have time to practice your faith and so on? But they used to do it. After they woke and so on, they used to gather in somebody's house to have, you know, what you call Maulid functions. So they used to call it Maulud. So they used to gather to sing qasidas and do all these things, entertain themselves, and then they go back, take a little sleep, and tomorrow is work again. And that is how they continued, and that is how they preserved their faith and transmitted some of it to their children. Now look at the scenario. The population is growing. Secular education was introduced. They're getting secular education. The people were able to practice a little bit of their Islam. Hindus practice their Hindu culture. Right? How much of it can you pass on to your legacy, to your children? Not very much. But whatever they passed on was there until in 1950, Maulana Abdul Alim Siddiqui went. 1950. And he spent 6 months there. And he caused a religious revival. And the Muslims took pride in practicing their faith. And it was a turning point. Then other scholars were introduced. Unfortunately, some of them began getting involved in the theological thing, whether it should stand, whether the Prophet is present or he is not present, and you know, Maulud and Ta'zim, Hazir and Nazir, and all these kinds of theological terms they began using to have a sort of internal confrontation. Whatever it may be. Then after Maulana Abdul Alim Siddiqui, he carried Dr. Ansari with him. And then Dr. Ansari had 4 visits there. And I happen to be a product of that because on the basis of his advice to the Muslim community, they started to send young men out to study Islam and to go back and preach.